You know, there's one thing these old pony cars have a lot in common is gauge problems. It could be the gas gauge, it could be the temperature gauge, it could be your oil pressure sending unit, and they're fairly simple things to diagnose. And I'm going to give you a tip on how to diagnose them, at least on the Mustangs and even on some of these GMs. What you got behind the instrument cluster after you take these screws out is, of course, a series of wires that lead to all the gauges back here. But one thing they have in common is this thing here, which is called a voltage limiter. And what it does is it feeds constant voltage to one side, and then coming out of it to each one of the gauges is a pulse of current. Now, Ford figured that out a long time ago, and they still use this kind of thing on cars today. And the reason why they want a pulse of current is so if you take a turn real quickly with your car around a turn, and the gas gauge just will fly up. A lot of GM products do not have voltage limiters, and that's why a GM car, like this old Camaro I'm working on here, if you take a turn too quickly, the gas gauge flies up over to full. You go the other way, the gas gauge flies down to empty. That's because it's getting the voltage too quickly, too fast. Ford figured out if you just do a pulse of current, that it'll allow it a little bit of time to kind of lag around, and it won't be so sensitive. So when you pull your dash apart and you take your cluster apart, make sure you got current, solid current to one side of this voltage limiter, and coming out the other side, you'll have pulse current. And then to one side of each one of the gauges back here, you're going to have pulse current leading to it, and then coming out of the other side is going to be pulse current leading to the sending unit that corresponds to that, which I'll show you what that is too. So let's lead on to the sending units, and I'll show you how easy it is to get those out and how to diagnose those too. Now, to check the continuity of your gas gauge and the wiring system that's related to it, you're going to want to get the car up in the air. If you go to episode 9 of Operation Mustang, my show, I have a whole how-to on how to get your Mustang up in the air, jack it up the right way, where to put your jack stand so you can safely get underneath it. If you don't know how to get underneath your car safely, go to episode 9. That'll outline the whole thing. But once you do that, what you're going to see underneath here, as far as the gas tank goes, is the back of the fuel tank sending unit, which has a wire coming off of it, and of course the fuel inlet is going into it. You'll unplug the wire, okay, and make sure that's a good connection. That's a good start. Just make sure it's not dirty or whatnot. And what you should have going there is, with the key on, you should have a pulse of current inside that wire, just like this one does. Now that tells me from front to back you got current, and that wire is a good wire right there. Then from there, what you'll do is you'll take a ground wire, one of these things here, okay? You'll put one end to the ground of the gas tank, and the other end you'll go into the wire itself right here. And you'll momentarily touch that. And what that's going to do is that's going to send the needle of the gas gauge all the way up to full. Or, of course, if you pull it off a little bit sooner, it'll go to halfway or whatever. But it tells you that the connection between here and the gas gauge is there, that everything is the way it should be. Now you've narrowed it down to the sending unit that's in the tank. Well, the sending unit that's in the tank is kind of a neat little device. This is what it's all about. If you pull the thing out, this is what you're going to see. A float that's at the end of a rheostat. You know how when you went over to Grandma's house for dinner on Sundays, and in the dining room she had that neat little knob that she'd turn up and down and make the dining room lights go on and off? Same principle right here. It's a rheostat, so it slowly gives more or less ground to that wire that I just tested over there, and that gets the gas gauge to work or not. So this is likely the culprit. Tell you what, 9 out of 10 Mustangs and GMs and all the others that are out there, it's usually the sending unit that's bad. So you can contact one of my suppliers. These things are real cheap. Pick one of these up for probably under 50 bucks. It's a real inexpensive way of fixing your gas gauge. All right, the easiest thing underneath the hood of these Mustangs, and really all the other pony cars out there for the most part, is they have one single wire that leads to the sending units. You got a temperature sending unit, you got an oil pressure sending unit, and you got a gas gauge sending unit. The gas gauge one you'll have to get underneath the car for, and the oil pressure and temperature sending unit are right on the engines themselves. The temperature sending unit is usually located in some sort of water passage inside the intake manifold or on the cylinder head. And on this little 289, it's right here behind the distributor. So the first thing you're going to want to do is check your circuit. Turn the key on, lift off the little connector, and then take your test light and see if you got pulse current. You see the pulse current that we have there? That pulse current is going through the voltage limiter that I pointed out to that's behind the gauge assembly itself. That tells me that you got continuity from here to the front. Now if you want to check the gauge to see if the gauge is accurate or if the gauge is any good at all, what you're going to do is you're going to take your ground wire and just ground that. Now by grounding that, what that will do is that will make the temperature gauge actually go up. That temperature gauge flies up. That tells you that the gauge is good, the voltage limiter is good, and also the wire that leads from here to those two pieces are good. So the process of elimination. Now you still don't have a temperature gauge. Well, that tells you that this little thing down here called the sending unit is at fault. That gives a gradual ground. The warmer the engine gets, the more ground this supplies to the gauge, makes the gauge go up. Now over here is the wire that leads to the oil pressure sender. Same type of principle here. Unplug it. There should be a pulse current inside that wire that leads to the sending unit, and there is. You'll ground it, and you'll look inside the car after you ground it, and you should see the oil pressure gauge start to fly up. Try not to let them peg, just enough where you know that they respond, and that tells you that the circuit is good from here to there. And then from there, what you'll end up doing is replacing the oil pressure sending unit that's at fault, because if it still doesn't work, then you know it's the sending unit that's fault. So really, you only have three major components in the whole system here for any one of those three gauges. You got your sending units, you got your voltage limiter, and of course you got the gauge itself. Now of course if somebody's hacked up the wiring on the thing, that could be an issue too, but if it's a fairly stock car that nobody's screwed around with, then you know it's probably one of those three things, and they're real inexpensive parts. If you go on my website, operationmustang.com, you go to any one of my vendors, my sponsors there, click on their tabs, and you'll go to their websites and you'll see how really inexpensive the parts are. Go to their websites. They help us out quite a bit, and I want to help them out too. And that's about it as far as sending units go, and temperature gauges go, and gas gauges go. So make sure you check out my website.